Welcome everyone to the online version of the Learn to Burn 1 class. I'm your host, Morgan Metter, and today we'll be discussing the effects of prescribed fire with Ricky Chastain. Ricky is a private lands biologist with the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission out of the Perrytown office. Thank you so much, Ricky, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Yeah, we look forward to hearing your talk today. So I'll let you get started.
Thank you. Today I'm going to be talking about prescribed fire effects, prescribed fire ecology, just some basic introductory stuff. A lot of the things that I'll go through will be covered in more detail in other parts of the presentations. So let's get started. What you're looking at here is a map of the U.S. With the various stages of prescribed fire that have historically occurred across the landscape. You might notice that this fire frequency, this data runs from 1650 to 1850, which puts it before the majority of the settlement of the country. So this is sort of a natural historical look of what fire regimes were like across the United States. Here in Arkansas, you can see that the Gulf coastal plain and a lot of the Delta was in a 2 to 4 year fire regime. And some of the Ozarks a little bit longer, as far as 4 to 6 years. But historically, there has always been fire on the landscape, and that fire has helped shape the different habitat types that were found in Arkansas. If you take this fire regime map and you overlay what is the historical range of the northern bobwhite, which is our native quail to this part of the country, you can see how well the home range of that bird matches the frequent fire frequency area of the Southeast. Again, when we talk about ecology, it's the relationship between organisms and their habitat. So certainly there is a very, very strong relationship between the fire frequency that had historically occurred across the Southeast and the bobwhite quail. This graph shows what the breeding bird survey indicates as far as a population decline for bobwhite quail from 1965 to 2015. Now, this is much later than the data showed the fire regime. And the reason for that is we want to demonstrate, the impacts that fire suppression has had on these particular types of species. It'd be interesting to note here that in 1944, Smokey the Bear was created. There was a national push to suppress wildfires. So that's about 20 years before this graph shows the data, which I think ties together that period that we began fire suppression in the United States and the decline of these populations. It is, bobwhite quail is a game bird, it is hunted, but there is also an entire suite of grassland dependent birds, songbirds, that show this very same type of decline in population. So it wasn't necessarily hunting that caused this decline. It's a big shift in habitat quality and habitat availability because of a big emphasis on fire suppression. This is going to go, these several slides here are going to go through sort of a time-lapse photography of what fire suppression does. This picture here from 1966, I want you to kind of focus in on these two trees. Again, this habitat here is very open, a lot of sunlight reaching the ground. You have a lot of grasses and forbs as the ground cover, very little mid-story. although there are, if you look closely, there are little saplings and things that you can see in the understory, but it has been controlled up to this point with fire. Next slide is approximately the same area. Here's the two trees. The one on the right's almost blocked out now, but the same two trees 15 years later. And those little saplings and sprouts that were in the understory have now been allowed to develop because of fire suppression. And you get this very, very heavy layer of mid-story woody development that occurs. And as this progresses, 2001, approximately 20 years later, here's the same two trees, but now the canopy is beginning to close above. There's very little sunlight getting to the ground. You don't have the grasses and forbs that cover the ground. It's gone to leaf litter now, and it's very little good wildlife habitat on the ground for browse or nesting or brood rearing. So that's just a quick glance at what the natural process is for nature if fire is taken out of the picture. The picture on the top left is sort of indicates the same thing we just looked at. A lot of our forests have been allowed to develop into these closed canopy forests with very little sunlight on the ground. So you get very little ground cover other than leaf litter, again, because of fire suppression. Our agricultural industries have become more and more mechanized, more and more intense in their activities. Back when the quail were plentiful, it was basically subsistence farming, small patch farming, lots of brushy fence rows, fallow ground. Ground were rotated annually because of no availability of commercial fertilizer. So to keep the soil fertile, they rotated crops around. So all of that type of farming is gone. The lower left, our forest industry has become very, very monoculture in its application of the forestry techniques that are used today. Looks almost like the farming up above. Plantation pine, short rotation, closed canopy, no habitat on the ground for wildlife. And in our cattle production, what used to be a lot of native forage has now been converted over to tame grasses such as fescue or Bermuda or Bahia. It's grazed intensively, so it's short. It doesn't provide any cover. So these are all, talked about ecology, the relationship of habitat and their organisms. These are all things that are impacting wildlife across the landscape, no matter what the primary land use is. And as a private land biologist, what we do is when we go out and we look at different private lands, no matter what the primary purpose is, we're looking for these opportunities to recreate some of that grass forb habitat for brood rearing and nesting habitat for ground nesting birds, or we're looking for opportunities to reintroduce prescribed fire into wooded landscapes, thinning those and burning those and opening them back up. We don't expect any landowner to convert all their property over to this type of habitat, but we look for opportunities where there are areas where we can reintroduce fire and reintroduce some management techniques to get us back to that high quality habitat. Aldo Leopold is often called the father of modern game management. And he's written several books on game management. The one from 1933 called Game Management. He made a statement that basically we can take the same tools that we have used in the past to destroy habitat And he says, creatively use those same tools to rebuild habitat. And I believe that's very true, and certainly amongst one of the most useful tools in the toolbox is prescribed fire. When we look at prescribed fire, well, exactly what are we talking about? Well, prescribed fire is burning for a specific reason, wanting to attain a specific fire effect on the landscape. And because these are prescribed or planned ahead of time, you can actually predict what the outcome should be before you ever light the fire. It's much like a prescription in medicine. You have a specific medicine to treat a specific ailment, and prescribed fire is a lot like that. There are a lot of different elements that go into what a prescribed fire is. Certainly, one of the major components is weather. Understanding the components of weather, the parameters of weather that you need to make sure that your fire behaves the way that you want it to. You can use seasonality, the times of the year that you implement your prescribed fire will provide different results, different effects on the landscape. The frequency with which you put fire on the landscape has its own impact on the plant communities and the effects that it has on them. And certainly your firing technique, how you put the fire on the landscape, affects how the fire behaves and therefore what impacts it has on the landscape. So there are a number of components that go together, that work together to help you achieve the goals of any prescribed fire. And your success is measured by the attainment of those goals. Are you looking to just simply top kill, control some woody growth in an old field or even in a forest? Are you going to implement the type of fire that actually cooks the root crown of saplings so that you actually kill those saplings because you want to get rid of them? Are you looking at maybe a post-harvest after a thinning operation or harvest operation? Are you looking to just consume those fuels and reduce your fuel load in a timber stand? More intense types of prescribed fire, you may actually want to scorch some trees and control some of your overstory, remove some overstory out. Those are intense fires, but they can be prescribed to do that type of thing. Or are you simply looking to try to get a grass and forb response where you've got good browse for white-tailed deer or good habitat for nesting and brood rearing habitat for ground nesting birds like quail and turkey? Much like being in the kitchen, there are two ways to cook, and prescribed fire can be looked at that in the same perspective. First, there is the deep fryer, and this is very intense fires that are used to remove overstory, to maybe control cedar encroachment, to kill woody invasion of open areas. These are very intense fires, have some very intense fire behavior. These are not the types of fires that you want to begin your prescribed burn career with, but it's something that you can become more comfortable with some experience. The second way is the crock pot method, which is low and slow. This is primarily what most people on private lands will utilize to achieve the things that they want to achieve. And it all goes back to those parameters we talked about earlier: the weather, firing technique, all those things that go together that make a particular prescribed fire behave the way that you want it to. There is an art and a science to prescribed burning. The science part is, the weather. I mean, we measure parameters of weather. Those are easily obtainable, very, very straightforward. The techniques, once you learn what those are, you know what they are, and you know what they can be used for. So there are certain known things, science, that goes into the prescribed fire, but there's also an art. And that art comes with observing what a fire does to the landscape, adjusting for seasonality, adjusting for the intensity, those types of things that you learn over time through experience. And if you don't learn something new out of every fire that you conduct, you're not being a good student of the tool. Every fire is a good opportunity to learn something about fire behavior and fire response by whatever plant community, whether it's an old field or forest or whatever you're burning. We'll look at a couple of management examples here. Managing old fields or a wildlife opening of some sort. Typically, you're going to burn these areas every 1 to 3 years, but you're going to base that frequency off of the response of the vegetation to the fire. It's not just an absolute, same yearly or burn interval from time to time. You can shift and change because things are always changing. You typically do this to control woody brush that is going to invade an area through seed drop and that type of thing. You want to keep these areas open, so you're wanting to control that brush. Again, altering the burn season. If you burn in the spring, you tend to favor the production of grasses. If you burn in the fall, you tend to favor the production of broadleaf weeds or forbs and that type of thing. So what are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to get on the landscape? And having that art involved to alter your burn season. And then there's some other techniques that you can use along with fire. A herbicide application, if you've got, say, a noxious plant such as Cerisa lespedeza or privet, Japanese privet, or tallow, there may be some problem plants, some invasive plants that you want to take care of, and you want to supplement your fire with some herbicide application. Another good tool is just disking, just resetting that seed bank from time to time, disturbing that soil, and using that along with your prescribed burn to manipulate that plant community. This slide, you can see the dividing line almost down the middle of the picture of a burned area and an area that hasn't been burned. The burned area just looks greener. You get a heavier component of your forbs, your broadleaf weeds, more diversity. And I think in wildlife, that's always an important component, is when you talk about habitat diversity, is the more plants, the more variety of plants that you have, the healthier that ecosystem is, and the better it is for wildlife. Fire will stimulate prairie plants, but it may not necessarily be a prairie plant, it's just any native species of plant. A lot of those are fire-dependent plant communities. They were developed over time as a result of fire regime, that frequent fire regime that we looked at the very beginning. And that's what it takes to bring those plant communities back. You're trying to control the brush. You're just resetting the clock on that natural succession that we looked through those time-lapse pictures. You're just keeping that plant succession to a forest from happening. So you're just constantly resetting the clock. Okay, we'll look at a management example in a forest. Like I said, you can use intense fires to thin an overstory or remove invasive cedar out of an area. You may be looking at a fuel loading after a thinning operation or a harvest operation, and you just want to remove that heavier fuel so that you can burn it at different intensities and different seasons after you've removed that slash that's left over from a harvest operation. Typically, you want to burn every 3 to 5 years. Again, that's not an absolute. You're looking to respond to the vegetation that comes back after a fire. If you're looking to control the woody stuff, then you're probably going to burn more frequently. And also, if it's poor soil or fertile soil, you'll have to burn more frequently in fertile soils to maintain control. But again, you're always looking at your vegetative response to help guide how your fire interval should be implemented. And you should never burn the same way, the same time every year. That's just not a good practice. We want to emphasize to alter the seasonality of burns. That's what occurred naturally, either through lightning strike, setting fires, or Native Americans setting fires. The seasonality, that it wasn't done the same way annually, year after year after year. There was a lot of variation at when those fires were on the landscape. Typically, the effects of fire in the forest is that you normally don't have overstory damage. Most landowners are not going to use fire for that purpose. They can use logging operations or something like that to thin the overstory. So typically in a good prescribed fire, there's no overstory damage. You do control the mid-story, that mid-level woody component that begins to shade out the ground. And you do remove the leaf litter and get down to bare mineral soil where you release the plants that are covered up with that leaf litter. So those are typically the results you would see, or the impacts, the effects of prescribed fire in a forested setting. Understand that your burn units are always changing. Every time you implement a thinning operation, a harvest operation, a prescribed fire, anything like that, the burn unit changes. The pictures at the bottom are basically the same tree there in the center. Before a burn, a few patches of some forbs and grasses, but a lot of leaf litter. And after that burn, you get a lot more of the grasses and forbs across the forest floor. So that fire is going to behave differently the next time you burn there. So burn units are always changing. And go back to your goals. What are you trying to accomplish here? Are you trying to produce more grass? Or are you trying to control saplings in a stand? Remove logging slash, whatever it is, your goals should dictate how you go about planning for your next prescribed burn. Like I say, don't assume that it's going to act, your fire behavior is going to be the same. If you've changed the way the habitat looks, the fuel loads in that habitat, in that burn unit, then it's going to behave differently, and you should be able to anticipate that with a good fire. Important always to remember the monitoring aspect of prescribed burning. And this doesn't have to be like some of these pictures here show of real scientific methods for monitoring. A lot of it is just visual observation. Are you seeing more grasses and forbs on the forest floor? Can you go out a month or two after a fire and document that some saplings were killed and removed off of the landscape? Are you seeing more wildlife on your property after a burn or two? That those types of things are indicative of improvements in the habitat quality. So it doesn't have to be a very scientifically rigorous method for monitoring, but you should build in some sort of monitoring activity. Uh, a good thing is like these pictures on the center and to the left, where you have a photo station that you stand at, every time you do a burn, and you just simply take a picture after the burn is done, and then after the response is given time to occur, and that gives you just a visual record over time of how habitat does change, because it does change slowly at times, and it's hard to keep track of that without some monitoring. So, and that's part of the learning process, is to monitor and make sure that you're reaching the goals that your prescribed fire was intended to have. And with that, I'll be glad to take any questions.
Now that was good, Ricky. Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about all that good history of fire and, obviously the effects of prescribed fire. I was going to ask to see if you knew kind of why we shifted to suppress fire across the landscape, because you kind of mentioned it. You had Smokey the Bear. I don't think people, at least some of the landowners that I come into contact with, they don't really know the history behind why we stopped using prescribed fire on the landscape.
Well, as you know, that fire frequency map was pre-settlement period, historic fire regimes. Once the country became settled, and you have people everywhere, houses everywhere, that fire frequency began to impact lives, humans. And so that was the primary push behind it, was where there had always been fire.
Mm-hmm.
Now there were a lot of different impacts of that fire to humans, because of our moving into areas where there were historical fire regimes. And now the impacts were not just, burning off a prairie. Now it was a prairie plus towns that were in the prairie. So
yeah, of course,
that became, the biggest emphasis. And oddly enough, the Smokey the Bear came out of after Pearl Harbor was bombed in 1941. A couple of years later, Japanese submarines surfaced off the coast of California and launched incendiary bombs over into the areas you see now that have those terrible fires. Mm-hmm. And that, how a war got involved with, creating Smokey the Bear, but that's some of the history there, that all of a sudden, not only were natural fires a concern, but now there was this threat of someone else starting a fire on purpose just to destroy property. So that was the impetus behind Smokey the Bear, was actually kind of a war-related incident that and then, Smokey the Bear, that became a national push all across the country through the Forest Service, which, we're fortunate to have a lot of national forests across the country. So the Forest Service took that banner up with Smokey the Bear and pushed that agenda to suppress fire.
Yeah, no, that's interesting hearing the history of that, because like I said, I don't think a lot of people know where fire went. They're just like, they see the habitats now and see what they look like, and you show pictures of what they're supposed to look like, and then it's just like, why don't they look like that? You know, so I think it's good to talk about the history.
Yeah, it's just a general
Mhm.
fear. Uh, and I want to make it very clear that there is a significant difference between a wildfire
Yes.
and a prescribed burn. And we're not advocating for wildfires. Nobody advocates for those, but
Hmm.
the correct use of fire on the landscape through prescribed fire is a very important tool, um, not only for human safety, but also for wildlife habitat.
Yeah, of course. And I think some people, when they think about prescribed fires, they automatically go to that wildfire mentality, just because there hasn't been, and I guess across like news stations or anything like that, they don't show prescribed fires. They just show wildfires. And so that's kind of the automatic notion of people that we don't want that, but it's good that you made the point that there is a difference between the two.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think it was cool seeing the overlapping range of prescribed fire and northern bobwhite, because we know bobwhites are referred to as the firebird. And
Right.
so they kind of where they get that name from, that they depend on fire to keep their habitats early successional. Um, and so, I'm sure you get a lot of landowners like I do asking well, where did all the bobwhites go? Um, and that's just a common question that I get. So you touched on it, a little bit here in this presentation, but if you have any other information that you would like to share, kind of at that sentiment.
Well, I'll say that the big umbrella, the big problem that kind of overarches everything from a Bob White standpoint is habitat change.
Mm-hmm.
Those slides I went through about the industrial forest, mechanized farming, all of those, the tame grasses and cattle production, all of the suppression of fire, all those components put together in a big landscape all across the southeast, view is the problem. Is just habitat availability and habitat quality. Now there are all sorts of minor things
Mm-hmm.
that come under that predation. With the loss of the fur market, we've got more mid-sized predators on the ground today than we've ever had. So there's certainly other components that feed into that problem, but if you don't have the good quality habitat on a landscape scale, that is really what hurts not only the bobwhite, but also that entire suite of migratory grassland songbirds that show the same types of population declines.
Yeah, and I think it's also an important note to make here that working lands, so cattle farms, or even plantations, can be good quality habitat if they're managed properly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That was the point about, we don't, as private land biologists, we don't go onto private landowners' property and dictate to them,
Mhm.
you've got to completely change everything you're doing
Mhm.
on your property, because that's just not feasible. We still have to produce beef, we still have to produce crops,
Yes.
we still have to produce timber. But where can we find those areas where we can alter our habitat management a little bit and get pieces of that good quality habitat back?
Mhm. Yeah. No, it's a good point. At this point, I don't have any more questions for you, Ricky, unless you just have, anything else to add.
Well, I guess the only thing I would add is this is sort of this a big, broad overview picture of prescribed
Mhm.
fire. The other segments of this workshop will go into depth into individual parts of it, and it's important that you take each one of those and gain from that, and then kind of put it all together at the end to have a good comfort level with the use of prescribed fire. It is one of the cheapest, most versatile management tools out there. So it's good for folks to be getting back to this understanding of the value of prescribed fire and implementing it on their properties for wildlife benefits.
Yeah, that's another good point. And I just want to remind anyone that's watching these videos that all these Learn to Burn 1 classes will be available either on the Quail Forever in Arkansas Facebook page or our YouTube channel. And they should also be available on the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission's social media platforms. So with that, I guess we'll sign off here. And thank you so much, Ricky, again, for taking the time to talk about the effects of prescribed fire and giving us a little bit of history on that. And if anyone watching again, if they have any questions, please feel to reach out to your local private lands biologist with the Arkansas Game and Fish Commission, or you can reach out to your Quail Forever Farm Bill biologist. And with that, I guess we'll just end here, and I'll see everyone in the next video. Thank y'all.